Hey everybody. So we are back um, at our live session, and again, nobody came, but that's okay because this meeting's being recorded. And tonight, what I want to talk to you about is one of the major themes of our course: sovereignty, authority, and power. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. When we commonly speak about powerful individuals, um, but in today's world, power is territorially organized into states or countries, and that control um, what happens within their borders. What exactly is a state? Well, to get a good definition of that, German scholar Max Weber defined the state as the organization that maintains a monopoly of violence over a territory. In other words, the state defines who can and cannot use weapons and force. And it sets the rules on how as to how violence is used. But individual citizens are very restricted in their use of force. So the states also include institutions that are stable and long-lasting organizations to help turn political ideas into policy. So some common examples of institutions are bureaucracies, legislatures, judicial systems, and political parties. So these institutions make states themselves long-lasting and help them endure even when leaders change. By their very nature, states exercise what's known as sovereignty, the ability to carry out actions or policies within their borders independently from interference either from inside or outside. So a state that is unstable to exercise sovereignty lacks autonomy, and because it is not independent, it may be exploited by leaders and or organizations that see the state as a resource to use for their very own ends. Frequently, the result is a high level of corruption. The problem is particularly prevalent in newly industrializing and less developed countries, largely because their governments lack autonomy. For example, military rulers in Nigeria stole vast amounts of money from the state during the 1990s, making it one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Today, Nigeria's tremendous revenues from oil have largely been evaporated before they are able to reach the ordinary citizens, providing evidence that corruption is still a major issue in Nigeria. So states, that should be plural, states, nations, and regimes. So states do much more than keep order in society. Many have important institutions. I've just gotten a message that I have lost connection, so I'm going to wait while hopefully I'm rejoined. There we go. So we're talking about states and how much more they do than just keep order in society. Many have important institutions that promote general welfare, such as health, safe transportation, effective communication systems, and economic stability. The concept of state is closely related to a nation. A nation is a group of people who are bound together by a common political identity. Nationalism is the sense of belonging and identity that distinguishes one nation from another. Nationalism is often translated as patriotism or the resulting pride and loyalty that individuals feel towards their nation. For more than 200 years now, the national borders ideally have been drawn along the lines of group identity. For example, people in one area think of themselves as French, and people in another area think of themselves as English. Even though individual differences exist within nations, the nation provided the overriding identity for most of its citizens. However, the concept has always been problematic, as when Armenians lived inside the borders of a country called Azerbaijan, especially now that globalization and fragmentation provide counter trends. The nature of nationalism and its impact on policymaking are clearly changing. So the rules that a state sets and follows in exerting its power are referred to collectively as a regime. Regimes endure beyond individual governments and leaders. We refer to a regime when a country's institutions and practices carry over across time, even though the leaders and particular issues change. Regimes may be compared by using these categories: democracies and authoritarian systems. So let's take a look at these two. Let's start with democracies. So this type of regime bases its authority on the will of the people. Democracies may be indirect, with elected officials representing the people, or they may be direct when individuals have immediate say over many decisions that the government makes. Most democracies are indirect, mainly because large populations make it almost impossible for individuals to have a great deal of direct influence over how they are governed. Democratic governments typically have three major branches: the executive branch, legislatures, and judicial courts. Some democracies are parliamentary systems where citizens vote for a legislative representative, which in turn select leaders of the executive branch. Others are presidential systems where citizens vote for a legislative representative as well as for executive branch leaders, and the two branches function with separation of powers. Democratic governments vary in the degree to which they regulate or control the economy. But businesses, corporations, and other companies generally operate somewhat independently from the government. Parliamentary systems in this type of democracy, the principle of parliamentary sovereignty governs the decision-making process. Theoretically, the legislature makes the laws, controls the finances, appoints and dismisses the prime minister and the cabinet, and debates public issues. In reality, however, strong party discipline within the legislature develops over time, so the cabinet initiates legislation and makes policy. The majority party in the legislature almost always votes for the bills proposed by its leadership, which usually is the prime minister and the cabinet members. Even though the opposition party, or parties that are given time to criticize the legislature, eventually supports the decision made by the executive branch. Because the prime minister and cabinet are also leaders of the majority party in the legislature, no separation of power exists between the executive and legislative branches. Instead, the two branches are fused together. Also typical of the parliamentary system is a separation in the executive branch between the head of state, which is a role that is symbolizes the power and the nature of a regime, and the head of government, which is a role that deals with the everyday tasks of running the government. For example, in Great Britain, the Queen is the head of state, who seldom formulates and executes policy, and the Prime Minister is the head of government, who directs the country's decision-making process in his or her position as a leader of the majority in a party in Parliament. Now let's talk about presidential systems. In this type of democracy, the roles of head and state of government and head of government are given to one person, the president. This central figure is directly elected by the people and serves as the chief executive within a system of checks and balances between the legislative and executive, sometimes judicial branches. The separation of powers between the branches ensures that power is shared and that one branch does not become dominant with the others. As a result, power is diffused and the policy-making process is sometimes slowed down because one branch may question each branch, the decisions of another branch makes. In order for presidential systems to truly diffuse power, each branch must have an independent base of authority recognized and respected by politicians and the public. The United States is a presidential system, as are Nigeria and Mexico. As we will see, an important question is whether or not the branches have truly independent bases of authority in Mexico and Nigeria. Some countries combine elements of the presidential and parliamentary systems, as illustrated in Russia's 1993 constitution. Although Russia is a questionable democracy, the Constitution clearly provides by the people for a semi-presidential system where the prime minister coexists with a president who is directly elected by the people and who holds a significant degree of power. Until recently, the Russian president has had a disproportionate amount of power. But the prime minister's position has become much more important since Vladimir Putin took the position in 2008. In other semi-presidential systems such as France and India, the power balance between two executives is quite different. Authoritarian regimes. In this type of regime, the decisions are made by political elites, those that hold political power without much input from citizens. These regimes may be ruled by a single dictator, a hereditary monarch, or a small group of aristocrats, or a single political party. The economy is generally tightly controlled by the political elite. Some authoritarian regimes are based on communism, which is a theory developed in the 19th century by Karl Marx, and altered in the 20th century by Vladimir Lenin. In these regimes, the Communist Party controls everything from the government to the economy to social life. Others practice corporatism, which is an arrangement in which the government officials interact with people and groups outside the government before they set policy. These outside contracts are generally business and labor leaders, or they may be heads of huge patron-client systems that provide reciprocal favors and services to their supporters. Here are some common characteristics of authoritarian regimes. Usually it's a small group of elites exercising power over the state. Citizens with little or no input into selection of leaders and of government decisions. No constitutional responsibility of leaders to the public, and a restriction of civil rights and civil liberties. Another type of authoritarian regime is totalitarianism. A common misconception about authoritarian regimes is that they are not legitimate governments. If the people accept the authority of the leaders and other countries recognize the regime's right to rule, authoritarian regimes may be said to be legitimate. Many people think of authoritarianism and totalitarianism as the same thing, but the term totalitarian has more negative connotations and is almost always used to describe a particularly repressive, often detested regime. For example, during the Cold War era, Westerners often referred to the Soviet Union as a totalitarian regime. However, authoritarian systems are not necessarily totalitarian in nature. Unlike totalitarian regimes, authoritarian governments do not necessarily seek to control and transform all aspects of political and economic systems of society. Totalitarian regimes generally have a strong ideological goal, like communism, and authoritarian systems lack and that authoritarian governments do not necessarily use violence as a technique for destroying any obstacles to their governance. One form of non-democratic rule is military rule, especially prevalent today in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. In states where legitimacy and stability are in question, and especially when violence is threatened, the military may intervene directly in politics and as the government organization that can solve the problems. Military rule usually begins with a coup d'etat, a forced takeover of the government. The coup may or may not have widespread support among the people. Once they take control, military leaders often restrict civil rights and liberties and in the name of order keep political parties from forming and elections from taking place. Military rule usually lacks specific ideology and the leaders often have no charismatic or traditional source of authority, so they join forces with the state bureaucracy to form an authoritarian regime. Military rule may precede democracy as occurred in South Korea and Taiwan during the 1990s, or it may create more instability as one coup d'etat follows another, reinforcing a weak and vulnerable state. Next slide. Corporatism and authoritarian and democratic systems. That should say co-optation, not co-optation. That's wrong. This is, let's see, can I turn this on? Hopefully, no. May I turn this on? No, it's not letting me. Oh well. Oh, maybe here. Maybe do this. Up. It's O and then it's P. I'm sorry, guys. I'm writing with my mouse. I got them wrong. Co-optation, not cooptation. Okay. So modern corporatism is a method through which business, labor, and or interest groups bargain with the state over economic policy. In its earliest form, corporation emerged as a way that authoritarian regimes tried to control the public by creating or recognizing organizations that represent the interests of the public. This practice makes the government appear to be less authoritarian, but in reality, the practice eliminates any input from groups not sanctioned or created by the state. Only a handful of groups have the right to speak for the public, effectively silencing the majority of citizens in political affairs. Often, non-sanctioned groups are band together. For example, Mexico's one-party system that existed for most of the 20th century banned all together. The oil wells and the refineries were placed under the control of the state-run Pemex, and private oil businesses were kicked out of the country. Corporatism gives the public a limited influence in the policy-making process, but interest groups are funded and managed by the state. For most people, would rather have a state-sanctioned organization than none at all, so many participate willingly with the hope that the state will still meet their needs. A less structured means of co-optation, or the means a regime uses to get support from citizens is patron clientelism. That's the next term right there, which is a system, where the state provides specific benefits or favors to a single person or small group in return for public support. Unlike corporatism, clientelism relies on individual patronage rather than organizations that serve a large group of people. Responsibilities and obligations are based on hierarchy between elites and citizens. So we're going to see examples of clientelism in China, in Russia, Mexico, and Nigeria. More recently, corporatist practices have emerged in democratic regimes as well. In democracies, corporatism usually comes into play as the state considers economic policy planning and regulation. In some cases, such as Scandinavian countries, many major social economic policies are crafted through negotiations between representatives of interests and the government agencies. In democracies that have nationalized industries, the directors are state officials who are advised by councils elected by the major interest groups involved. The democracies that do not nationalize industries, many regulatory decisions are made through direct cooperation between government agencies and interests. So a basic principle of democracy is pluralism. Pluralism is a situation in which power is split between many groups that compete for a chance to influence the government's decision-making. This competition is an important way that citizens may express their needs to the government, and in a democracy, the government will react to the citizens' input. Democratic corporatism is different from pluralism in two ways. First, in democratic pluralism, the formation of interest groups is spontaneous. In democratic corporatism, interest representation is institutionalized through recognition by the state. New groups can only form it if the state allows it. In democratic pluralism, the dialogue between interest groups and the state is voluntary, and the groups remain autonomous. In democratic corporatism, organizations develop institutionalized and legally binding links with the state agencies so groups can become semi-public agencies acting on behalf of the state. As a result, groups and individuals lose their freedoms. So just how much corporatism and... Oops, not there yet. So just how much corporatism a democracy will allow before it becomes an authoritarian state is a question of much debate. For example, in the United States, the National Recovery Act of 1934 was judged by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional, largely because it gave the government too much to say in private industries' hiring and production decisions. In more recent years, a U.S. government agency has been criticized for hiring people from private interest groups to fill regulatory positions, allegedly destroying the ability of government to guard the public interest and give special interest control of policy. In the 1970s, labor unions in Great Britain were often accused of strong-arming public officials, including the Prime Minister, into passing labor-friendly policies into law. In all of these cases, the entangling of government and private interests may have been criticized for undermining the principle of diffusion of power basic to a democracy. Okay. Let's see if we can answer some questions here. Some review questions. All right. Review questions. A system which citizens vote for legislative representatives who in turn select the leaders of the executive branch is called what? Well, if I had people here, I would normally be asking them, and then hopefully they would be typing their answers feverishly into the chat box. But we don't have people here. So I'm just going to give you a minute to kind of think about this. And all right, so the answer here is, just grab my highlighter. C. Parliamentary systems. So some democracies are parliamentary systems. These are where citizens vote for a legislative representative which in turn select leaders of the executive branch. Others are presidential systems, where citizens vote for legislative representatives as well as for an executive branch leader, and the two branches function with separate powers. But remember, in the parliamentary system, the principle of parliamentary sovereignty governs the decision-making process. Theoretically, the legislature makes the laws, controls the finances, appoints and dismisses the prime minister and the cabinet, and debates public issues. In reality, however, strong party discipline within the legislature develops over time. So the cabinet initiates legislation and makes policy. The majority party in the legislature almost always votes for bills proposed by its leadership, which is the prime minister and the cabinet members. Even though the opposition party or parties are given time to criticize, the legislature eventually supports decisions made by the executive branch. Because the prime minister and cabinet are also the leaders of the majority party in the legislature, no separation of power exists between the executive and legislative branches. So our answer here is parliamentary systems. One more question. Which of the following is the best way to distinguish between democratic and authoritarian regimes? Which is the best way? Just going to give you a few minutes to think about it. And the correct answer here is B. Oops, let me get my highlighter. All right, so you're probably thinking to yourself, some of these may be true, like A here, democratic regimes hold elections. Well, that's true, but sometimes authoritarian regimes hold elections too. Okay, so remember, it's asking for the best way. Okay, so democratic regimes must offer their citizens true choice at the voting booth so that it is possible to vote a leader out of office. Like I said, authoritarian regimes may hold elections, or they may endorse capitalism, which is private ownership of the means of production. Schools and mass media are important agents of political socializations in most regimes, regardless of type. Democratic regimes, like authoritarian regimes, often center their legitimacy on ideology. So ideology is not a characteristic that distinguishes democratic regimes from authoritarian regimes. Okay? All right. Well, that concludes our review of sovereignty, authority, and power. Remember, I'm here each week, and hopefully we'll see somebody come in. If you have any questions or need any additional information, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you for listening.